This man is a pathological liar. He doesn't know the difference between truth and lying.
Sure, it's one thing to forgive a man who insisted your wife was unattractive and your father a serial killer, but at least he's not applauding him. Oh wait, that's exactly what Ted Cruz was doing even after Trump had left the room.
I don't know why, but every time you run for re-election, you are maybe the second most hated man behind Donald Trump in politics. They're gunning for you big time, politically speaking.
Well, listen, I wear that as a badge of honor.
The fact is, Ted Cruz is willing to go out of his way and applaud Trump and willing to go on the news media and disparage our justice system, even though he's a lawyer and he knows better, because he's so desperate for Trump's spotlight and he's hoping that somehow what he thinks is Trump's power can rub off on him. But the fact is that Trump has insulted him and his wife and his father so many times, it's actually embarrassing that he's still willing to curry favor with him. Let's think about some of the things Trump did say about Cruz. So he tweeted a picture of Ted Cruz's wife next to a picture of Melania, and he said, quote, "No need to spill the beans. A picture is worth 1,000 words." He insinuated that Ted Cruz cheated on his wife. He said that he was a nasty guy, quote, "the biggest liar," and perhaps the worst for a Republican. He said, quote, "Ted Cruz was worse than Hillary Clinton."
There was real suspense then going into the 2016 Republican convention about whether or not the deeply offended Senator Cruz would even endorse Donald Trump, the Republican nominee for president. But Senator Cruz looked into his heart and found nothing. Nothing that would prevent him from endorsing the presidential candidate who attacked and lied about his father and attacked and lied about his wife. And there was Senator Cruz today in that lineup of utterly egoless Republican men craving their moment with Donald Trump, craving a possible handshake or a possible pat on the back or a wink or a smile, a glance, anything from Donald Trump. Watch now, Senator Cruz crave that moment after Donald Trump passes by Senator Cruz and pays more attention to other, more obscure people in the room. He kept clapping after Donald Trump left the room. After the door was closed, did he think Donald Trump could see through the door?
But Trump doesn't reserve his bad words for supporters like Ted Cruz. He also does it to Lindsey Graham, another person willing to say and do anything to curry favor with Trump, despite the fact that Trump has humiliated him in the past. Here are some of the things Trump has said about him. He called him a disgrace. He said, "I don't think he could run for dog catcher in this state and win." He called him, quote, "one of the dumbest human beings I have ever seen, a nut job. I could push him over with a thimble." And then just recently, after Lindsey Graham expressed his support for a federal abortion ban, he said perhaps his worst insult ever, that, quote, "Democrats are thrilled with Lindsey Graham." I don't know what's more embarrassing, the fact that these grown men are willing to support a man who has insulted their character, their intelligence, their wife, or the fact that they do it even though they know the kind of person that Trump is. How do we know they know? Because they've told us.
Donald Trump alleges that my dad
was involved in assassinating JFK. Now, let's be clear. This is nuts. This is not a reasonable position. This is just kooky. And while I'm at it, I guess I should go ahead and admit, yes, my dad killed JFK. He is secretly Elvis, and Jimmy Hoffa is buried in his backyard. You know, Donald's source for this is the National Enquirer. The National Enquirer is tabloid trash, but it's run by his good friend David Pecker, the CEO, who's endorsed Donald Trump. And so the National Enquirer has become his hit piece that he uses to smear anybody and everybody. And this is not the first time Donald Trump has used David Pecker's National Enquirer to go after my family. It was also the National Enquirer that went after my wife, Heidi, that just spread lies, blatant lies.
So this is what Cruz has said about Trump. Quote, "This man is a pathological liar. He doesn't know the difference between truth and lies. He lies practically every word that comes out of his mouth. The man can't tell the truth, but he combines it with being a narcissist at a level I don't think this country's ever seen." He also called Trump amoral and a bully. I have to say, I've never agreed with Ted Cruz more. And the fact that he knows this about Trump, he withstood those kind of embarrassing attacks against him and is still willing to clap and keep clapping once Trump left the room is just astonishing.
I mean, Ted Cruz knows how dangerous Donald Trump is. Obviously, he spoke clearly about that in 2016. He must not think any of this really matters. I mean, he must not actually be concerned about the long-term health of the American democracy or find it that important, because they understand that, you know, like Billy said, they were there on Jan 6. He knows what a threat Donald Trump is. He spoke clearly about it in 2016, and they continue to prop him up. I think it reveals something more deeply cynical about the Republicans that hold on to him, is that they don't think this republic actually matters.
Because the fact is, Trump is actually not that powerful. He's never won the popular vote. He continued to lose the midterms when he was president and afterwards when his endorsed candidates lost. The fact is that it is the bully pulpit that makes people still rally around him because they're afraid of more insults than him actually having political power that is required to win elections. You know who knows this? Paul Ryan, who has said on Fox News recently that Donald Trump is unfit for office.
I do support getting out of the primaries legislators who are going to Washington, going to Congress to legislate, to join a team to advance conservative principles.
That's what Donald Trump says when he primaries Republicans. So you support that?
He's cost us a lot of seats. I could probably spend some time and come up with the numbers. He cost us the Senate twice. He cost us the House because he is nominating. He is pushing through the primaries people who cannot win general elections, but who pledged fealty to him. That's not a good way to build and grow a party. Ever since 2016,
but what's the difference between that and what Kevin McCarthy?
The point I'm trying to make, let me finish that point. Sure. We need legislators, not entertainers. And what Kevin, I assume, is doing here is making sure that we get legislators in these seats, because the people who voted to oust him, he didn't deserve it. There was no reason to. They did it for fame. They did it to become famous. They're nihilists that are not there to legislate, that they're entertain. So the more we can replace an entertainer with a legislator who wants to actually get things done, the healthier Congress as an institution is going to be, the stronger the Republican majority will be.
Paul Ryan is willing to say that because he's a little bit insulated from Trump's attacks because he's not running for office. So it's not that Lindsey Graham, who called Trump way back when a, quote, race-baiting, xenophobic, religious bigot who doesn't represent the value of men and women in the military. Yes, Lindsey Graham and Ted Cruz know exactly the kind of person who they're willing to prop up in Trump, and that's just embarrassing.
Some of y'all know I do every week a podcast.
I do every week a podcast. I do a podcast every week.
I do a podcast 3 days a week.
I do a podcast.
I do a podcast. I do a podcast. Last year, I launched a podcast. 2 years ago, I launched a podcast. 3 years ago, I launched a podcast.
I do a podcast, my last podcast.
Today's podcast on the podcast.
Podcast on my podcast.
Back to Ketanji Brown Jackson's confirmation hearing.
You know, a couple of years ago, I was doing my weekly podcast.
My podcast, 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 the podcast, 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 podcast. if you're a grifter, you got to grift.
Enough! Send him to the big house, not the White House. Get the new exclusive tees, mugs, and stickers right now at store.MeidasTouch.com. That's store.MeidasTouch.com.